Hello and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This is a podcast where I break the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. In this show, I speak with a variety of people from different perspectives about esotericism, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, and related topics. This show delves into all sorts of interesting areas of discussion to provide perspectives that you might not have heard of. This is your host, Georgina Rose. I am a perennialist and polytheist, and I am excited to have some conversations. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that I have not brought up, but it is something that is relevant to some other things that I have discussed, and that is actually the procession of the equinox and how that relates to the calendar. Now, that may sound a little strange, but we will explain what we mean by that. My guest today is someone who I've interacted with Twitter on for quite a while, who has some really interesting stuff to say. Can you introduce yourself, who you are, kind of what you discuss, and yeah, tell us about who you are.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I am known as Glass Delusions on Twitter. That's my internet moniker. I am an astrologer, an art historian, a cultural critic, and many other things. Um, those are some of my. Those are, I guess, my most my strongest passions, I guess. And I'm a writer as well, and I mostly write about astrology. I am a consulting astrologer, but I also like to write about the sort of poetic themes of astrology as well. Um, and I'm also a perennialist at heart. I think um, that is the life principle that I live by. Um, but I'm I grew up I grew up Catholic, and I grew up in a very strange part of the world, New Mexico, which has some very niche, mystic, folkloric Catholicism in it, and so I think that flavors a lot of how I see the world. And I'm a lapsed Catholic. I don't really practice, but it definitely, certainly, the mysticism of it flavors how I um, just how I interact with the world, and I guess how I interact with everything. So yeah, and today we'll talk about, this is something that is probably my favorite topic to think about, write about, research, and it's the formation of the Gregorian calendar. Um, I'm quite critical of it, which again, my background as a Catholic, and being raised in the Catholic faith sort of informs this intense scrutiny and skepticism and criticism of the Gregorian calendar. So, yeah, I'm excited to chat about that today.
Yeah, I definitely think all our religious backgrounds 100% flavor our experiences. I think in general, while there is, of course, objective esoteric truth, I think people, you know what it is? I think people always filter the world through what they're familiar with and the archetypes they're around and their sort of sense of self. And so I think knowing that about someone is always very, very helpful. To jump right into the topic, I actually have question this a little bit myself. Specifically, I have always been bothered by the new year being a somewhat arbitrary date. This is something that I have ranted about on Twitter quite a few times. But I guess to begin, what is the problem with the Gregorian calendar, and why does that have to do with esotericism? Because I think once people hear you out on this, they might actually really get it. But I think to people's minds, right, we're so ingrained in our cultural understanding of the calendar that it feels like a shocking thing to even question. So,
Hmm.
what's the deal with it? Why is it bad?
Yeah. Yeah. So, just to explain a little bit about why Pope Gregory, instituted his Gregorian calendar, is in previous calendrical systems, namely the Julian calendar, that was the one that had preceded right before Gregorian calendar in the Western world. Um, Basically, the way that it was measuring the Earth's orbit around the sun, there was a leap year every 100 years. And we basically intercalate an extra year, a leap year, or sorry, an extra day during the leap year, because the Earth's orbit around the sun is irregular. It's 365.25 days. So to sort of make up for this extra quarter of a day, quarter of daylight, different calendrical systems will intercalate. They'll add an extra day to sort of help balance things out. Without an intercalation, you basically, if you're measuring 365 days or 360 days around the sun marking a year, you quote unquote lose a day. And so that's kind of hard. It's kind of abstract and hard to wrap your mind around. But basically, what was happening is we were marking New Year's around solstices and equinoxes. And you really start to notice again, I'm using quotations here because part of the part of what we'll get into is like what I'm questioning is what it means to lose a day. But you mark the loss of a day, or you notice the loss of a day with something called the precession of the equinox. And so what happens with the precession of the equinox is the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere, over the course of 2000 to 2500 years, moves back 30 days. So for example, right now, our spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere happens on or around March 21st. After 2,000 years, eventually the vernal equinox will happen on February 21st because we lose those days. And we're sort of moving backwards in time because of the irregular orbit that the Earth makes around the sun. So to sort of fix that, different calendrical systems, as I said, will add in an extra day so that you don't feel this loss of a day. And what happened with the Gregorian calendar is he intercalated the leap day, February 29th, every 4 years, and that made it fixed time in a much it fixed the precession of the equinox. It made this loss of a day much slower. And so, and mainly what happened is it made the spring equinox virtually stationary. It fixed it to March 21st, for much longer than the normal 2,500 year precession of the equinox. Um, did that make sense? It's
No, that
so
makes
complicated to explain.
I think it makes a lot of sense because when we look at like the seasons of the year, I think people notice that things don't always happen exactly on the day they're supposed to happen.
Right.
And I find a lot of people are somewhat bothered by this. And so you see this thing where, like, socially, a season will start far before, like, it looks like it is on the calendar, like this fall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Equinox, as of recording, this should come out a little later, but we're recording this a couple of days after the fall equinox. And people have been like enjoying fall for probably a month prior to this. Like I think you're making some good points. Now that raises the question of, if you were to change the calendar to accommodate for this, would it be like new solstices and equinoxes every year? Like how would that shift?
Yeah. So, well, to answer that directly, and then I'll make another comment later. But the like fully, like the equinox won't fully shift a full 30 days until after 2,000 years. So this is like not something that a single human could ever feel or really notice, unless, of course, I mean, now we're noticing it because the Gregorian calendar, which was instituted in 1582, it has so warped and distorted our perception of our relationship to the sun, our perception of time, that now we are starting to feel it. But this is a civilizational arc, basically. 2,500 years for the equinox to fully shift backward 30 days is that's noticeable to a civilization. It's not noticeable to any human. It's not noticeable to any society, because societies, at least in my sort of colloquial definition, a society is sort of has a smaller lifespan than a whole civilization. So, but the thing is that it's a more accurate way to measure, again, just the Earth's relationship to the sun. Um, and the other thing about my other comment was, why is the Gregorian calendar a problem? Well, it's a problem because, as you just pointed out, we start to notice when our perception of time is distorted, we start to notice seasonal changes different from what our calendar system is is telling us. And so there's something called meteorological spring, which I didn't realize this until I really started researching this in earnest. But meteorological spring is basically what environmental or meteorologists basically how they measure the start of spring, and they measure the climate and when climate changes like are starting to shift seasonally. And so meteorological spring actually occurs around March 1st right now, instead of the vernal equinox that the Gregorian calendar tells us, which is March 21st. So yeah, our seasons do start about 20 days ahead of time, 20 days ahead of what our current calendars tell us. And this can obviously create a lot of hysteria, as we've seen. We think like, oh, like seasonal temperatures are not lining up with the equinox. This must mean that there's like climate chaos or some sort of like imbalance in the environment, when really there's not. It's a very normal the precession of the equinox is a normal thing that the earth goes through. And again, it's really all about the earth's relationship to the sun and our experience of that, like what that means. And yeah, so there's all sorts of accommodations that you have to make because of the Gregorian calendar and because of making the spring equinox stationary. You have to make all sorts of accommodations in terms of when you start planting crops, when you start your harvest, things of that nature. And I also just want to say too about something that my research led me to, is that I think that Pope Gregory instituted the Gregorian calendar, and I think that there are some interesting and strange coincidences. I think that this was a political project. I think that in terms of astrological ages, so another way that the precession of the equinox obviously has an effect on how we on our planting and harvesting cycles on the different hemispheres, but it also has an effect for in astrology and in esotericism. So basically, to explain how the precession of the equinox is sort of measured with astrology, is on the vernal equinox. At the moment that happens, you look to the eastern horizon and you see which constellation, which zodiac constellation is rising on the eastern horizon at that time. And since about the year 0 AD, roughly, the constellation of Pisces has been on the eastern horizon during the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. And so that is, uh, I well, I won't get into it too technically, but that is known as the age of Pisces. And so with the precession of the equinox, as again over the course of 2,500 years, as the equinox shifts backwards, eventually on February 21st, we would look during the vernal equinox, we would look to the eastern horizon and we would see that the zodiac constellation of Aquarius would be on the eastern horizon. And so that would be known as the age of Aquarius. So essentially, when the vernal equinox occurs on February 21st, we will be in the age of Aquarius, no longer in the age of Pisces. And what this means from an esoteric standpoint is the astrological ages sort of cast a projection for how the civilization is going to, like what themes the civilization is going to experience over the next 2,000 years. The age of Pisces is a very Christian astrological age. The age of Pisces, the themes that are associated with the age of Pisces are very associated with what Christianity formed itself to be. Namely, like a messianic savior, a singular sort of monotheistic tradition. I mean, it's also no coincidence that Islam, Buddhism are also turning up at around this same time, and gaining popularity as these sort of, I guess, counterparts to Christianity. They're also about a singular sort of monotheistic messiah type savior person. These faith traditions, they do have a lot of thematic elements that are similar to Christianity, but I would say Piscean thematic elements. These monotheistic faiths have. So yeah, and so the age of Pisces is on a timeline. It starts at around AD 0, and 2,500 years later, we're going to shift into the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius is totally different from Pisces. It is the themes associated with Aquarius are networks, non-hierarchical structures, communities, no gods, no masters kind of thing. Aquarius is very sovereign individual kind of sign. I've seen sort of finding individuality within the greater network or community. And so my hypothesis about all of this is that in 1582, Pope Gregory, and astrology was not yet banned in the Catholic faith at this point. Pope Gregory is definitely, almost certainly consulting with astrologers, because astrologers were just, I mean, they were so common as consultants. And he's looking down the barrel at the fact that in about 1,000 years from where he is in time, the age of Pisces will come to an end and the age of Aquarius will begin. And so by fixing the spring equinox and making it stationary and forming a calendrical system that obscures the precession of the equinox, he's basically fixing us in the age of Pisces, trying to extend the age of Pisces, trying to extend this like Christian-based astrological age. And so that's why I say it's a political project. It's like a political spiritual project for Pope Gregory. There's all sorts of other weird things too in there where he wants to have, basically there in 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea formed, which was a major formation for the early Christian church, and arguably when the early Christian church really started to have dominion over the larger Western world. And the Council of Nicaea met when the spring equinox was happening on March 21st. In 1582, I can't do the math in my head right now because but that's like a few hundred years later. In 1582, the spring equinox was happening around March 11th, but Pope Gregory formed the Gregorian calendar to shift the equinox back to March 21st when it was happening during the Council of Nicaea. So this is all just feels like a political project to me for all of these things. And you know, my research is sort of, I'm not sure why he wanted to take us back to a March 21st equinox, and why he didn't just leave it at March 11th, which was the equinox in that time period. But I think it has something to do with the fact that in 325 AD, we have the spring equinox occurring on March 21st. On the horizon, the constellation that's rising is like 29, 28 degrees of Pisces. So at the beginning of the age of Pisces. And he fixes us there.
Perhaps it was to prolong Pisces, right? Because if you fix
Yes.
it at the beginning of the age, then it lasts longer. And so it
Mm-hmm.
makes complete sense as a political kind of plan, because astrological reality like grounds us, right? It is sort of the guide point of the universe. And so if you could theoretically manipulate astrology, you could theoretically manipulate everything, because
Mm-hmm.
as above, so below. And when we look at how people engage spiritually, right? All these spiritual holidays in modern esotericism are built around these Gregorian calendar, equinox, and solstice dates. And so
Mm-hmm.
even those spiritual practices, a lot of them not even being Christian and being attempts to move away from Christianity, are fixing it further in. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Now, speaking of the age of Aquarius, I think there is so much, I mean, weird takes on it. People have been saying we're in the age of Aquarius for a long time, which is astrologically incorrect. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's an interesting thing of people who have been believing we've been in the age of Aquarius for a long time. What is your thoughts on all of that? Because I'm sure you have heard those discussions, like people who have been saying this for a long time, even though it is
Mm-hmm.
not something that has happened yet.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that well, with the like reuptake of astrology during the New Age, in the early 20th century, I think that it basically like, I think that New Age is a total psyop. But it what happened is that there were astrologers who started to realize, oh hey, and I think that a very common date for the actual beginning of the age of Aquarius is around the year 2140. And so I think what was happening in the 1960s 60s, 70s is sort of like, oh, we have to prepare. The age of Aquarius is going to be here in about 150 years. So this is like the beginning of it kind of thing. And I think that basically new age and pop astrology and any kind of popular new age discussion, it sort of took that and ran with it, and it became just this like zeitgeist. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, and this means peace and whatever. And also, there's I think that a lot of activist movements get co-opted by whatever forces create propaganda, and it was sort of propagandized into like, oh, the revolution is already here, it's already the age of Aquarius, we already have to like break down barriers, break down hierarchies. It was just kind of sexy to be able to brand the kind of free love movement in the 1960s and 70s to brand it as the age of Aquarius. And so then people just ran with it, and it became this incorrect label for our time. And that is sort of the broad picture. The other thing that was really getting on my nerves a few years ago is in the year 2020, when Saturn and Jupiter made their conjunction in Aquarius, everybody also was like, this is the age of Aquarius. And which is just, again, another demonstration of how like something like it was the age of what happened there with Saturn and Jupiter's conjunction. It was a new age of these outer planets making a conjunction, which, of course, I'm sure has this particular significance in Hellenistic astrology, and it's sort of initiating an age of air for like cultural production, but it doesn't mean the age of Aquarius the way that everybody thinks it is. So again, I just think that there are so many pop astrology just flattens all of the nuance that you have to have when you're talking about astrology. Like everything is so meta and layered in terms of how you measure time with astrology. And so it's just like people will misunderstand things and they just kind of like run with it. And so I think that's what happened. I think that it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what the New Age astrologers were saying in the middle of the 20th century. And instead of listening and saying like, oh, it's like the age of Aquarius, we have to prepare for it because it's happening in the next 150 years, they just automatically thought, oh, it must already be here.
I think also there is some general misunderstanding of Aquarius as a sign,
Yeah.
because Aquarius is a Saturn sign. And I think that connection gets so lost because
Hmm.
the problem, I mean, I have a lot of issues with pop astrology and the New Age. Read on the New Age, just read Renee Guénon's rants about it. But pop astrology, it oversimplifies everything, and a lot of it was written before we had certain traditional astrology texts translated and accessible. Um, but Aquarius as a sign is so associated with, you know, independence and whatnot. And that's there, but it is still a Saturnian sign. And I think
Hmm.
until you remember that it is a Saturn related sign, it is hard to fully understand what Aquarius represents. And so I think the pop understanding of Aquarius is actually quite confused.
Oh yeah, totally. Totally. And I think that um I also like to think about Aquarius in relation to its counterpart Leo, and there's this like sort of like social justice interpretation that's always attributed to Aquarius, when it's sort of like, no, if anything, like like people have sort of inverted their interpretations of Leo and Aquarius, in my opinion, where it's like, no, actually Leo is the one who wants to like uplift everyone, and they like, see everybody as these like pure individuals, and everybody deserves all of these like, everybody deserves equanimity, equality, equity, and like, and we as individuals should like thrive as individuals or whatever. And Aquarius is like, it's not the sign of like collective power. It's more of the sign of like, you are a person within like a structure, and you are a person within a system, and these systems have rules, and there are benefits to following these rules, there are disadvantages to breaking these rules. And yeah, that goes along with everything that you were just saying about what it means to be ruled by Saturn.
I think in general, I like seeing astrology on the line of like axes. So I
Hmm.
think people don't think about this until they look at the North and South Node, because your North and South Node signs are obviously opposite signs of each other. You can
That's
also
true.
see it through rising and descendant. But
Hmm.
looking at the sign that is across the wheel from the other sign, I think helps you understand the corresponding one. And so I
Mm-hmm.
really like when people bring up like the idea of like axis in relation to astrology, because I really do think it is a helpful way to understand things, because what the sign is opposite of are kind of different experiences of the same thing in a very strange
Mm-hmm.
way. And so I do think saying that gives people a good thing to think about, because I think that's a good way to conceptualize astrology and understand it on a deeper level.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it also, like, on in terms of astrological ages, it's also very interesting to think about the way that civilization has progressed. If we think about the soon to come age of Aquarius and what had happened during the age of Leo, this isn't my idea. I heard this from a content creator on TikTok who I'm not sure is still active, but she went by the name Phaedrus, and she had sort of conceptualized the age of Aquarius and the age of Leo as sort of like these turning points for human civilization and language specifically. She had said that likely the age of Leo was when, which happened about 6,000 years ago. Um, the age of Leo was the time when individual language was formed and people different languages broke out, different cultures sort of I guess identified themselves by their languages, by how they spoke and wrote, if they wrote. At the same if writing had, which writing didn't really appear at the same time, but as oral language, but in any case, it's that's an interesting thing for me to think about, just because I think about like, okay, what can we anticipate with the coming age of Aquarius, and how, like, what do we think about what might have happened to civilization during the age of Leo? And I'm thinking about like, how is language going to evolve? What is how are we going to communicate with each other? I think about like returns to telepathy, maybe returns to sort of like a sort of like psychic mind exchanges of communication. Um, so it's just, yeah, it's totally interesting, and you can get so much in your interpretations when you open yourself up to the axes. Absolutely.
So when we are discussing these calendar type ideas, I think a lot of people are going to bring this up, this old astrological debate in the West that everyone loves to rehash. We love rehashing this. I wonder how many people are going to listen to this conversation and see it as an argument for using sidereal calculations on top of Western astrology, because I know that was a thing people discussed for a while.
Hmm.
How does that play in?
I think that I honestly think that we need to have a little bit more of that. I think that sidereal zodiac, I it couldn't hurt is my position on it, and I think that people are, I think that's going to make astrologers who already sort of have a Eastern West blend going. I think it's just going to further motivate them, and honestly, I think that they're going to be the ones who advance the field more, because I think that like our tools for measuring um for like our astronomical tools and our tools for measuring space can only sort of help us. I think that that's to our advantage, and I think that understanding the geometry of the constellations can only help us better. I'm sort of a big proponent. That said, I'm not um I'm still in my studies. I'm still firmly Western astrology, and so I don't have a lot of literacy and technique at this point in my practice to fully talk unpack sidereal, um but I think that there's significant benefits to becoming a little syncretic with things, and I think that there are benefits to advancing the field when you're measuring when you're measuring outer space um, in a more accurate, precise way.
Yeah, and I realize I should probably explain these calculation differences. So basically, there are two kind of ways to calculate the movements of the planets. Tropical astrology, or what most people in the West are familiar with, is mostly based on seasons for the calculations. And sidereal, it comes from Vedic or Eastern astrology, and it is much more based on the actual movements of the planets. If you get your chart done by a Vedic astrologer, you're going to see completely different things on it. Now, there are these people, and it is highly contentious, who are using Western astrology with Vedic time calculations, who call themselves sidereal astrologers. A lot of people feel weird about it because they feel it is kind of a blending of two different systems. Now, other people think it is a great thing. So I just felt like I should drop in that context there. It's about how we calculate and whether it should be on seasons or actual movement of the stars and planets.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'm still sort of like, again, dipping my toes in here, but I also think that Ptolemy was Ptolemy is the astrologer who sort of I'm not going to say invented tropical astrology. Like invented seems like the wrong word, but sort
Discovered?
of yeah, I guess invented or discovered, the age-old debate. Yeah. But he's the one who sort of formulated how to measure zodiacal calculations based on the seasons. And he's operating during a time when um the vernal equinox is happening close to the time that we experience it, at sort of at the end of March. And so I think that Ptolemy is living in a context in which the precession of the equinox is uh, observed and honored, and he just probably assumed that that was going to be the case forever. And so it's sort of like people will update this system according to the precession of the equinox, and like we can fix our zodiacal constellations to the seasons because obviously that people will always be observing the precession of the equinox. And in Ptolemy's eyes, it's sort of like, who would ever do away with the precession? Like, who would ever think to fix the equinox, make it stationary? So, he didn't anticipate Pope Gregory. That's my take. Might be a little unhinged, but
No, I
I don't
think
know.
that's an important thing to throw in here because I think this might be where some of the disconnect is, because when we're basing all
Mhm.
these esoteric dates on tropical astrology, that timeline, remembering when the Gregorian calendar shifted, I think is really valuable because it makes me wonder if people who are either doing specific rituals or holidays on solstice and equinox dates, should they be shifting those even if the calendar hasn't shifted yet? Should they
Mm,
be like recalculating things? What does this mean for season people? Because I have interacted with a lot of people who do spiritual practice based around the seasons who
mhm,
complain to me about it. Like I have heard a lot of people complain basically that the dates of the season starts are wrong, or
mm,
they don't really meteorologically make sense, but like my entire religious holiday is built on this day. Do I keep
mhm,
using it? Like what should become of those people in your view? Because I think of people who are affected by the current dates of the solstices and equinoxes and how that relates to esotericism, those people I think are definitely people who should be thinking about it.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think I the most exaggerated thing that I can say is kind of what I truly believe. I think that we need to either restore some kind of Julian calendar or figure out a new calendrical system that is more akin to the Julian calendar, or maybe something like the Greek Orthodox Church calendars. Those seem to be to make a little bit more sense. I mean, I just am so anti Gregorian calendar at this point, and I think that we should do away with it, truly, because I think that there's at this point in time, 500 years after the Gregorian calendar gets instituted, it is affecting us in a material way, and it's and a material and spiritual way. Excuse me. And we are feeling it. And when you like, we're feeling the fact that spring is actually starting around March 1st, not starting 3 weeks later. We're feeling that fall is actually starting uh, way sooner. And that that goes hand in hand with the spiritual practices. I just think that like if there's I don't know. I sort of just think that if you are going to practice, if your spiritual practices are based around seasons, then you need to follow what you are observing meteorologically and just do away with this calendrical system or the calendar as we know it, because now it's wrong. Like we know that it's like incorrect. And there so much time has elapsed between the institute between 1582 and now that we are actually starting to observe it. We're actually starting to observe the fact that, oh yes, our time system can tell us that Earth's relationship to the sun remains the same, but we can feel, and our Earth, our environment, our climate can feel that it doesn't stay the same.
Okay, so I'm throwing this out because I think some people will throw this out. It would be a complete rework. What would be your thoughts on the lunar calendar? Because I
Mm.
think it screws everything up in a lot of ways. But astrologically, if you're trying to understand things like nakshartas or the lunar mansions, you kind of start looking at it. Do you think the lunar calendar could be a solution, or do you think that would just throw everyone off entirely? Because that would change the way the whole like everything is timed.
Right, right. And I think um I think that it would be, well, I don't know if it's like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back, because it totally turns everything upside down, as you said, and, like, the conception, like, how we orient ourselves to everything would change, and so that seems, almost so revolutionary that it's counter-revolutionary. However, there are huge swaths of populations that do observe a lunar calendar, so it's not that, like, I don't know, like, it wouldn't, affect it wouldn't be so affecting, like, people can obviously live by a solar calendar. Like, it's not like it would be, I think that trying to get people's minds around throwing out the Gregorian calendar would actually be a harder battle than trying to get people to adhere to a lunar calendar.
You know, that kind of makes sense because I mean the moon cycle we all can intuitively see. And
Mhm.
since perhaps it's so visual, and you are right, there are specific cultural and religious groups that do actually still use a lunar calendar, even if they're
Mhm.
also using the Gregorian calendar on top of it, right?
Mhm.
I feel
Mhm.
like with those groups, it's like they use kind of both. Um, but yeah, I mean, changing the calendar in general, I think would be a bit of a mind shift. So you may as well, I guess, like do it right if you're going to do it, instead of take some other way through. Um,
Mhm.
in terms of astrology, how do you think it would affect the astrological field if the Gregorian calendar, like let's say we woke up tomorrow and it's gone, we're back on the Julian calendar. How would this impact astrology and people who are astrologers?
I think that I th- this is might be controversial. I do think that a more sidereal, like blending of sidereal and tropical, sidereal and Western astrology would occur because it would have to. Um, I think that our seasons would, um, the initiation of our seasons would sort of reverse back into and like sort of find a greater symmetry or harmony with the sidereal zodiac. Um, so I think that to me is the strongest effect that it would have on astrology on the field. Um, we would be observing, and that would totally destroy uh Western astrology as we know it now as sort of this like modern, um like Western modern astrology, which of course takes into account the outer planets that could not be seen, during Hellenistic times. But um, yeah, I think that there would probably just be a greater alignment between tropical zodiac and sidereal zodiac if we shifted our seasons.
Now, one thing that I always think is interesting to consider because a lot of people learn astrology through looking at their own natal chart and attach their natal chart so strongly to their identity because the natal chart is the guide to the soul. If you whenever actually anyone looks at their chart, they go on one of those astrology sites and they flip that button from tropical to sidereal, right?
Hmm.
The entire chart changes. And I think it creates, I don't know if it's identity confusion or just something like it messes with people's heads, right? And they get confused and they're like, okay, so what does this mean? What does this say about me? If we were to somehow fuse sidereal and tropical and make like some new system, what does that do to people's natal charts and what does it do to the natal chart as an identity? Because I have heard some people argue like you're kind of a fusion of both of these charts, like you're kind of both depending on how it works. Like, what does this mean for how people view their identity in their natal chart? Because I do think that is most people's relationship to astrology until they get really way into astrology.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that consulting astrologers would have to change their practice in how they, in terms of like how they read for people and how you write horoscopes for people. I think that you would have to focus a lot on aspects between the planets. I think that people, this is also like super radical, and I haven't really fully incorporated it yet into my own consultation practice yet, but like this is something that I try to steer people less in the direction of like, you're a Libra sun with a Virgo ascendant and a Gemini moon. Like I try not to focus on those identifiers. Rather, I would say, oh, look, your chart ruler Mercury is in its cazimi. It's exactly conjunct the sun in Libra. And like, this is really interesting because of this, this, and this, and gives you these traits. Oh, look, your Gemini moon is making a trine to or a square to your Virgo ascendant kind of thing. Like, I focus on the aspects. And I think astrologers would do well to start shifting people away from this like over identification with signs, because it's so the discrepancies between sidereal and tropical zodiac are so great at this point that it's like we just need to get people to like maybe back off a little bit from like their identifiers and start focusing on like the relationship between the planets. Because also, and like I think that that's a better entryway to astrology, because like as you said, like right now, people, the way that people get into it before they move further into astrology, like they really start to identify with like their big three or their sun sign or whatever. And the only way to sort of get away from that is to just start putting those things in the background and bring to the forefront the aspects between the natal planets. And then that helps you progress along to understand that like as you get further into analyzing your own chart, or when you work with an astrologer, you start to understand that you're not just your fixed natal chart, you're your natal chart plus the transits that are occurring. And of course, transits are all based around aspects and the geometrical relationships. So that I think that that is a really interesting way to go. I know a few astrologers have sort of started to do that. And one astrologer who I consider a colleague and mentor, sort of, is mostly doing that when he consults with people, is just focusing on their aspects and not necessarily on their zodiacal signs. And so I don't know. That's also like super radical, and that's a super like controversial thing to say, I guess. But I think that that would be really helpful to the field. Um, if we were to start doing a more syncretic sidereal plus west plus tropical zodiac systems.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think in general, the way people relate to astrology is, you know what it is, we were crapping on pop astrology earlier, and I think it's brought up again because the way pop astrology, which is everyone's culturally first introduction to astrology, at least in 95% of the cases. I'm sure there's someone who became a pro astrologer the first second they heard about astrology, but for most people it is pop astrology is their intro.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, what do they see first? Horoscopes. And when you look at horoscopes or even memes, because we're in the internet age and people get their information from memes, I think astrology is like personality typing in the
Oh
pop.
yeah.
Like I've seen MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is like a personality test type thing. Nothing to do with astrology, but I've heard people compare it to astrology, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
what do these two things have to do with each other? Because astrology is not personality types, right? Like that's
Right.
not, personality typing is a arguably may not even exist like psychology idea, right? That you can like
Mm-hmm.
classify people into types. Astrology, it's about the map of the self. It's not even really about your person. Like your natal chart is not like your personality, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is a map to your soul and life. Like it's more complicated than that. And I think people are so ego syntonic with their natal chart because they see it, whether consciously or not, they're seeing it as personality typing. And I think pop astrology has really programmed us to see zodiac sign equal personality type. And I think breaking past that, even if you consciously recognize that's incorrect, it's kind of hard to do that when that's your first exposure. And so
Yeah.
I think that's like a whole inner challenge people will have to go through who are listening to this, um, and a whole phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really just it just the revolution has to start with small steps, and I think that I really admire the astrologers who will just outright, again, because I'm kind of trying to do this myself, but I'm not brave enough to just like take the full step because it's whatever. But I really admire the astrologers who are like, I'm not going to focus on signs at all. I'm just going to focus on the fact that your Saturn is conjunct your Venus, and wow, your love life is fucked up or whatever. That's a it's a flattening of it. But like focusing on the relationship between the planets, I really, really think that they are the ones who are onto something, and they're kind of starting this deeper change within the culture of astrology. Um, and yeah, pop astrology has done a huge disservice. Also, the whole fact of like how horoscopes are written, where it's like Pisces is February 19th to March 20th, and people think that like their solar sign is the sign that they should be reading their horoscope for, when it's, of course, the
Rising.
horoscope is written for the rising. Yeah, excuse me. And uh yeah, so there's just everything is wrong with the way that pop astrology has just misconstrued the whole field. And so it's just going to take individual astrologers making a choice to just change up their practice a little bit. Maybe put the signs, the zodiac signs, further into the background and bring the planetary aspects to the forefront.
And really, that horoscope thing, if you're going to read horoscopes and you're going to read some pop astrology stuff, actually do read it for your rising sign always.
Yes.
For me, I read them for fun. I don't take them as seriously as I do like proper astrology. But when I started reading, I'm a Cancer sun and a Leo rising in tropical astrology. When I started reading them for Leo, things made a bit more sense. So I do actually recommend you apply that if you're going to read and watch horoscope type stuff. But no, that's not the sum of astrology. And with that, I think that's a beautiful place to stop. I think this has been a really good conversation that
Yeah.
hopefully gets people thinking, questioning your entire identity and astrology. Good activities in the afternoon, I think. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so, where can people
Great.
find you? Where do you exist on the internet? Um, and where are you raising more fun questions like this? I like questioning everything, and I like being controversial. So those are good things that we got to do today.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I am on Twitter as Glass Delusions. And my Substack, which you can find through my Twitter, is called Cosmographia. And that is where I publish a newsletter, certainly every 2 weeks on the new and full moons. And then usually in between there, I'll post another article about, mostly these days, it's been mostly about planetary ingresses. And more astrology stuff, but I do have a lot of things written about the age of Aquarius and about the Gregorian calendar on that Substack as well.
Perfect. I will have all of that linked in the show notes or the YouTube description, depending on where you're watching this podcast. That will all be below. If you want to support this podcast, we are supported through Patreon. You get all the episodes early, and you get a bonus episode in 8 times a year. Ironically, it's every solstice and equinox in the Gregorian calendar and the midpoints between those. So that is 8 a year. And you can find me, your host, Georgina Rose, under the name Dot Darling, DAT, Darling, like the pet name, on every platform under the sun. I exist everywhere. So find me there. Thank you so much for listening. Have an amazing day, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right. Bye.